research into the origin of AIDS?
Well, right before the AIDS epidemic began in 1981, for several years prior to that, I was studying Kaposi sarcoma, the cancer that became known as gay cancer when gay men in New York City and San Francisco and LA began to become sick. Some of those men had Kaposi sarcoma, and I had studied that. And I had found an infectious agent in that disease, and those findings were reported in medical journals. And at that year and a year or two later, other papers suggesting that Kaposi was due to a particular bacterial infectious agent.
I see. Could you explain what Kaposi sarcoma is?
Well, Kaposi sarcoma is a form of cancer, and it has a skin form where you get skin tumors that tend to be purple-red. And we've known about Kaposi sarcoma for 100 years. It was first discovered in Austria, and then in the middle of the century, it was determined that it was a very common form of cancer amongst blacks in Central Africa. It's always been in the United States considered to be a rather rare form of cancer, usually seen in older men, particularly of Jewish or Italian extraction.
I see. Now, you pointed out in your book, I believe, that there is a quote-unquote a gay Kaposi sarcoma.
Well, no, actually, it's
an African.
Well, it's interesting because when the AIDS epidemic appeared on the scene, Kaposi sarcoma became one of the telltale signs of this disease in young gay men. And it was very interesting because the doctor started calling it gay cancer. Well, we had known about it for 100 years, and it had never been gay until 1981. And it was interesting because when I was able to study the skin tissue, being a dermatologist of Kaposi sarcoma, I found the same agent in gay men that we found in heterosexual Jewish men who I had studied prior to AIDS. And the reason I got into the AIDS research in this regard is because of this cancer. And then I assumed that the scientists were very interested in this agent that I discovered in Kaposi sarcoma. And what I found was there was really no interest in this. They were all focused on finding some new mysterious virus out of Africa. There was like no interest in my microbiologic studies. In fact, to this day, if you ask physicians and AIDS experts what causes Kaposi sarcoma per se, the cause is still unknown. And even though I have reported in the medical literature that there is an infectious agent associated with this, so I knew from the very beginning that the politics and the science of AIDS was extremely strange, because everyone was looking for a mysterious virus and disregarding all other research which would lead you to suspect that there might be some other agent.
I see. Does the AIDS virus cause cancer, or is it a cancer in itself, or is there any proof of a cancer?
Well, I think what the AIDS virus does, obviously, is lower or destroy the immune system. And when that happens, there are certain forms of cancer that become very prevalent. And obviously, Kaposi sarcoma is one of those very rare cancers that comes to the fore when a person is extremely or has a disease of immunosuppression. For instance, we know that before AIDS, people that were undergoing kidney transplantation, and they would have to be immunosuppressed so that the kidney that was being transplanted would not be rejected. Some of those patients developed Kaposi sarcoma. But it's just very interesting because when the AIDS epidemic hit in young gay men, it was started to be known as a gay cancer, which, to my way of thinking is like Nazi propaganda. Nevertheless, as far as I was concerned, they wanted to make it a gay disease, and it's still, considered in the minds of many people still a gay disease, even though the cancer that is associated with that has certainly never been associated with gay people up until the 1980s.
I will a little bit later on touch on the hepatitis B
vaccine. Okay.
What I want to ask you now is, have immunodepressive diseases similar to AIDS existed before? And I think
Oh, of course, but not to the degree. In fact, we have made diseases, for instance, if you have cancer patients, and part of the chemotherapy, as most people know, is very immunosuppressive. And as a result, certain kinds of infections take place in those people that are similar, if not identical, to the kind of things that take place in AIDS.
Right, so there's a lot of correlation, and you can't really...
Well, exactly. For instance, the so-called gay pneumonia, which went along with the gay cancer, in the early cases of AIDS, the way you diagnosed AIDS prior to us discovering the AIDS virus was if you had a young gay man who was immunodepressed and had either Kaposi's sarcoma or a certain kind of pneumonia. Those were the two diseases that made a diagnosis of AIDS. But that pneumonia had been seen before, particularly in children who were being treated for cancer, who were suppressed immunologically deliberately, and then developed the same kind of so-called gay pneumonia that men did, you see.
Well, to touch on a related topic, is there any proof that there was a request by authorities for an immunodepressive disease?
Well, I'm sure when you read my book that you saw the testimony, the Senate testimony from the Department of Defense back in 1969, 1970, where the biological people were being requested to deal with some of these genetically engineered viruses with the idea of making a super powerful germ for which the normal immune system would have absolutely no defense. And it was predicted in 1969 that within 10 years, such a germ would be developed and would be able to destroy the immune system. And of course, 10 years later is when we had the first case of AIDS in New York City, was in 1979.
Well, wasn't there somebody who would step up and say, look, do you realize the implications of this? Or of what could happen with this? Wasn't there anybody that...
Well, scientists are very good at making things, but they're not very good at the antidote. For instance, we'll take the atom bomb. I mean, we've made all these atom bombs. Now, what is the antidote to the atom bomb? The only antidote to the atom bomb is don't be under it when it drops. There is no antidote to the atom bomb any more than there's an antidote to the nuclear waste that is being made as a result of atomic warfare. So you would probably say, well, why are we making atom bombs? We've been making atom bombs for a half a century, And we're still making them and still setting them off. Why? I'm not sure why. It's kind of silly, I think.
So it comes down basically to the Defense Department, or there's been a history of the Defense Department basically asking for and getting research and deployment of...
Well, we're always looking for bigger and better and cheaper ways of killing people. I mean, that's the history of the world as far as I see it. I mean, why would you want to create a germ for which there is no natural immunity except to kill people? And the trouble, of course, with producing some of these germs is that obviously some of these germs, once you become infected with them, can spread to other people. So what happens is, and that was always a worry with some of these germs, is what would happen if some of these laboratory-designed germs that they were designing in the 70s, what would happen if some of those germs got out? Well, the only thing that the government wanted to do was to just check epidemiologically, check the people who might have been exposed, and then check their blood a year or two later, and what have you. So the only way they were going to respond to one of the germs escaping would be to blood test people. And of course, it's interesting because when this AIDS virus was introduced, what is the next step? The next step is to blood test people.
Not much of a...
Well, I mean, there is no antidote to the AIDS virus.
Well, there is the claim that animal viruses are responsible for the advent of AIDS, and of course, one theory is the so-called green monkey theory, of course, and through the bite, through saliva, or blood inoculation. Now, how strong is this theory?
Well, I think the virologists would like everyone to believe that. I don't think they all believe that. In my view, when you start to see a strange virus that has never before been seen on the planet, that all of a sudden starts attacking groups like Africans in Central Africa and young gays in New York City, and all of a sudden you're dealing with a new virus that has never been seen before, the first thing, it seems to me, that you have to ask yourself is, could this be one of those viruses that were predicted to be available in the late 70s? Could it be one of those viruses that got out of a laboratory and either accidentally or deliberately contaminated certain populations? I mean, I think it's very strange that, you know, in the 1990s, everybody knows that anyone can get AIDS, irrespective of your race and your sexual preference and all of that. So how come it only affected certain groups of people initially? It only affected black Africans, not white Africans, but black Africans, and it didn't affect old gays, and it didn't affect, you know, teenage gays. It affected middle-aged, you know, young, sexually active men.
Why were these groups targeted? Why do you think?
Well, I mean, to me, as you know, I have traced AIDS back in America, not to Africa, but I have traced AIDS back to government scientific studies using gay men in cities such as New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, and several other cities. And it traces back to experiments where gays were used as guinea pigs with their consent to be injected with the hepatitis B vaccine trial. And of course, the vaccine trial started in 1978 in New York City. And by 1979, within a few months of those vaccine trials, the first cases of AIDS were discovered. Now, I know that the textbooks and the scientists tell you that AIDS came from Africa. Now, I don't believe that American AIDS came from Africa. Now, I'm not saying that I don't believe in African AIDS. Certainly I do. But AIDS in America does not trace back to Africa as they would have you believe. It traces back, in my opinion, to the same year, the same geographic site, the same population that was exposed in 1978 to government experiments, namely gay men in New York City. Young, healthy, gay men.
Now, this was an experimental as opposed to commercial hepatitis B vaccine.
Yes, in other words, they were determining to see if the vaccine that they were preparing would protect you from hepatitis. And because gay men were supposedly at very high risk to hepatitis, it was decided to use gay men. And of course, the gay men volunteered very nicely because they realized that, you know, the hepatitis virus can spread sexually, and naturally, if the government tells you, look, we have something that can protect you and your community from disease, will you help us test this virus? Will you help us test this vaccine? Many gay people said, of course. And so the gay communities was the group that was chosen and that agreed to be part of this experiment. And ever since the gay community responded to that experiment in 1978, and the experiment continued until 1980, this was the beginning of the Holocaust in the gay community. It traces right back to gay experiments, not to Africa, but to gay experiments. But nobody wants to talk about that.
What is the current end result of that? Is there statistics?
The end result of this is between American AIDS through the gay experiments and African AIDS, which we haven't touched upon, which traces back to smallpox. The result of this is that now we have a worldwide pandemic of AIDS that threatens millions of people.
Now, getting back to the scenario that it could be laboratory produced, another theory as opposed to the green monkey theory is the combination of the bovine leukemia and sheep physna viruses. Does this combination exist in nature, or would it have to be?
Well, nature would never take two species and put them together. Nature doesn't do that.
Maybe a sheep bit a cow.
Well, yeah, maybe the sky is falling. No, the scientists do that. Scientists take germs from one species and give it to another species of animals. And in doing so, of course, you can take a virus, for instance, that is fairly harmless to one species, but you put it into another species and you're very likely to have a lethal disease, which is why, for instance, there are monkeys in laboratories that carry very harmless little viruses. But God forbid you should be bitten by a monkey or in some way infected through monkey products. You could be in deep trouble, because once you transfer an infectious agent from one species to another, it has the potential to be extremely dangerous.
I see. Now,
in fact, that's how these superviruses, are made. You take, for instance, there was an experiment that was done in the 1970s, and it's I think, a very interesting experiment for people to know about, in that there was an experiment where chimpanzees were taken away from their mothers at birth, and the little baby chimps were weaned by cow's milk that the scientists knew was infected with a certain kind of virus. So as the chimps were being fed this virus, some of the chimps became very, very, very ill. And some of the chimps died. And in their deaths, the veterinarians produced 2 diseases in chimpanzees that had never been seen before. The first one was cancer in the form of leukemia. Leukemia had never been seen in chimpanzees ever before. And the second was pneumocystis pneumonia, the so-called gay pneumonia, that is the hallmark of AIDS. So we know that scientists can produce gay pneumonia. So if somebody comes along and says, well, I think, that the AIDS virus is an experiment and it was deliberately done, people say, oh, no, they couldn't do that. Of course they could do that. If you take the right virus and you put it into human beings, you can make AIDS.
Could AIDS create itself on its own in nature?
Of course not. I don't think AIDS would be that stupid. Why would Mother Nature want to phase out human beings? I mean, that's kind of dumb.
It would have happened before now if it was going to happen, wouldn't it?
Well, it's very odd that we had genetic engineering in the 70s, and all of a sudden at the end of the decade we have this new disease. I mean, again, people say, well, that's a coincidence. I mean, if you start adding up all the coincidences, you would have a whole textbook full of coincidences that happened in the late 70s as regard AIDS.
Is it possible that, well, obviously genetic engineering, especially that dealing with viral diseases, is commonplace in labs. Do you think it would be easy for these diseases to, where would this kind of research most likely take place?
In the best laboratories in the country. Places like UCLA, Harvard, military, NIH, National Cancer Institute, Biological Warfare Labs. I mean, who was supposed to develop this super germ? If you go back into the Senate testimony, you will see that the government was asking the leading universities and the leading lights of biological research to contribute to this. And of course, the whole thing is secret. I mean, biological warfare is totally secret. I mean, as we have learned, through the Freedom of Information Act, we now know that back in the 50s and 60s, this is what we know of. God only knows what they did to us in the 70s. I'm sure in, another 20 years they'll realize that AIDS is, another screw-up. Everybody will know it by that time, I'm sure. But at the current time, you can't get certain things unless a certain amount of time has elapsed. But we know now that biological people were doing all kinds of experiments on our own citizens, covertly and in secret. I mean, that's not new. And of course, the people that do that, that involves the CIA and the FBI. All these people are either directly or indirectly involved in these experiments, like the one where the Navy put a cloud of bacteria over San Francisco in the 50s. And some people got sick and somebody died. And the government, said, well, we didn't do anything.
but then it comes out later, 20 years
Well,
later.
of course. And what about all the military experiments with LSD and drugs, you know, where the government lures people through prostitutes into hotel rooms, and then the CIA is there, and they're putting Mickey Fins in, and the guy is, you know, collapsing, and then they photograph the whole thing, and, you know, I mean, crazy stuff. And then people, you know, getting LSD by mistake and jumping out a window. Hey, unfortunately, that happens. Military people were exposed to all kinds of stuff, covertly. I mean, after all, we know that this country has a large biological warfare department and all kinds of experiments. But who is taking part of that, in that? Nobody knows. But you know that the leading universities are taking part in that. But these people are sworn to secrecy. A lot of secret stuff going on here.
Well, don't a lot of the universities feel that, well, if I get a grant from the department, from the government or the Department of Defense, that, you know, they want to understand more about a certain virus or a certain disease.
Look, it all boils down to money and prestige and ego gratification and all of that stuff. I mean, you know, the government spends a lot of money on science. If it wasn't for the government, a lot of these scientists would be out of jobs. And a lot of people feel justified in doing this because, you know, this is my country, and we have to keep our country safe. Unfortunately, what they don't tell you is that this biological warfare, particularly now with genetic engineering, has the potential of destroying the human race, just like atomic warfare. The trouble with atomic warfare, I mean, the nice part about that is people can choose not to push the button. Interest in my microbiologic studies. In fact, to this day, if you ask physicians and AIDS experts what causes Kaposi sarcoma per se, the cause is still unknown. And even though I have reported in the medical literature that there is an infectious agent associated with this. So I knew from the very beginning that the politics and the science of AIDS was extremely strange, because everyone was looking for a mysterious virus and disregarding all other research which would lead you to suspect that there might be some other agent.
I see.
Here, other papers suggesting that Kaposi was due to a particular bacterial infectious agent.
I see. Could you explain what Kaposi sarcoma is?
Well, Kaposi sarcoma is a form of cancer, and it has a skin form where you get skin tumors that tend to be purple-red. And we've known about Kaposi sarcoma for 100 years. It was first discovered in Austria, and then in the middle of the century, it was determined that it was a very common form of cancer amongst blacks in Central Africa. It's always been in the United States considered to be a rather rare form of cancer.
Could you tell me how you got involved with the research into the origin of AIDS?
Well, right before the AIDS epidemic began in 1981, for several years prior to that, I was studying Kaposi sarcoma, the cancer that became known as gay cancer, when gay men in New York City and San Francisco and LA began to become sick. Some of those men had Kaposi sarcoma, and I had studied that. And I had found an infectious agent in that disease, and those findings were reported in medical journals at that year and a year or two later. Cancer, usually seen in older men, particularly of Jewish or Italian extraction.
I see. Now, you pointed out in your book, I believe, that there is a quote-unquote a gay Kaposi sarcoma.
Well, no, actually, it's
an African.
Well, it's interesting because when the AIDS epidemic appeared on the scene, Kaposi sarcoma became one of the telltale signs of this disease in young gay men. And it was very interesting because the doctor started calling it gay cancer. Well, we had known about it for 100 years, and it had never been gay until 1981. And it was interesting because when I was able to study the skin tissue, being a dermatologist of Kaposi sarcoma, I found the same agent in gay men that we found in heterosexual Jewish men who I had studied prior to AIDS. And the reason I got into the AIDS research in this regard is because of this cancer. And then I assumed that the scientists would be very interested in this agent that I discovered in Kaposi sarcoma. And what I found was there was really no interest in this. They were all focused on finding some new mysterious virus out of Africa. There was like no interest.